Okay, Pops.
Yes.
All right. Every once in a while, we got to get some real experts on this show. And today, I think I lined up a good one.
I'm pretty sure you did. He between his personal knowledge and his educational background, he knows more than we'll ever know.
All right. So, in a moment here, I'm going to bring David Chao, which you may know from Automotive Press, his YouTube channel. But if you don't know him from the YouTube side of things, you would definitely know him from his vast LinkedIn page and incredible professional career. He was born and raised in Japan, studied in the United States and in Canada, and has worked in lean manufacturing with automakers for a long, long time. Those degrees from MIT and Harvard, they go a pretty
What a
long.
slouch!
Let's pull David in. And David, we're just thrilled to have you joining us here at YAA. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, no, pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be with you guys. You guys are just fantastic people, and I'm very excited.
Well, we're excited to have you. And as a college dropout,
Same here.
Well, as the two of us as college dropouts, I'm really looking forward to some of the insights and overviews that you'll be able to share with us.
Of course, yeah. I mean, some of the brightest people in the world don't have college degrees, so right? We all have our ways of making life work, and you guys are some of the people I respect the most. And so I'm just happy to be talking about supply chain with you guys.
For sure, for sure. And I think it's worth mentioning that the folks that don't have college degrees that were in charge of supply chains are probably the ones that got us into the mess we're currently in. So we should.
I think you're taking a shot at people. Wow.
David, how about we give you a chance? This is what you do professionally. And it's worth mentioning your channel over at Automotive Press is a wealth of knowledge to learn and understand what's going on in automotive right now. But can you give us a bit of an overview? Like when we say supply chain, what are we actually talking about?
Yes, yeah. So there is a lot of confusion about supply chain. So I actually teach this at a sort of MBA level. And so the confusion is that when people hear the word supply chain, they think it's supplier chain or supplier management, which only refers to management of the suppliers that you buy goods from. But actually, supply chain consists of the entire chain, which is why we call it chain. So from the time you buy something from a supplier, then you receive it, then you have to manage the receiving of it, then you process it, like either manufacturing it or converting it into something else. Then you have to store it, inventory management. Then you have to ship it to a customer, and then you have to then go through the whole transaction of receiving money, right? So now the money flows backward. And in some cases, the goods has to be returned because it's effective. So the product can actually go all the way backward to the very first line of the chain. So that whole chain, including supplementary work that is attached to that chain, such as design and engineering and quality control, that whole thing is actually called supply chain. Whereas most media only focus on the beginning of the supply chain, which is the buying process. That's what we are all facing as an issue right now with chips. But the current situation with the chip shortage is not just the chip shortage issue, it's the whole supply chain has been fragmented as a result of the chip shortage. And so that's where the confusion is. So essentially, supply chain management is managing the services and goods that begins with the supplier. So it does begin with supplier and sometimes with their suppliers. Mm-hmm. And then managing that flow of information or goods all the way through until the customer gets what they want and they pay for it. So that's the end of the chain, basically. So that's the definition of supply chain.
So if I hear you correctly, right now the chip supply issue might be considered the weakest link within that chain.
I would, well, the main thing, so just to explain why the problem exists, is that we're buying, so it's kind of interesting because it's like a pancake, right? There's layers and layers of things that are happening in the supply chain issue. So you're buying, first of all, the problem is started with the chip, the actual chip, which is a wafer. And the wafer comes in different sizes, like 8-inch or 12-inch. And like, for example, an 8-inch wafer would have 1,500 chips you can make out of that wafer, but it takes about 6 months to produce that wafer. And so when the shortage took place and there was everything from water shortage in Taiwan, where the biggest supplier is located, to fire in one of the factories in Japan, to what else, plus the pandemic shut down certain factories. And so there was lack of people working in the factory. So all those issues compounded, and so the chip itself, the semiconductor chips, were short, right? And at the same time, there was explosive demand for chips used in other electronic goods, not cars. And then car companies, fearing the worst, dramatically reduced the forecast for buying chips. So you have this super unbalanced perspective in terms of demand and supply. So that's where things started. Then there was a cascading effect because to ship the chips, you need transportation, freight, trucking, all the stuff that has to happen for us to get the chip. And then once you receive the chip, then what we call tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers have to then incorporate the chips into their circuit boards, which is another manufacturing process. And then at that point, the circuit board manufacturing itself faced issues because other components that goes into the board were also short. So you've got this compounding effect until such time that I don't think we can now blame only the chips for the current issue. It's gone way beyond that, but it started with the chip, and it's still continuing on because the wafer themselves are still in much demand. And these manufacturing companies, like when the chip manufacturers or board manufacturers cannot figure out how to increase capacity, I'm the person they usually call. Usually I go in to figure out how to increase capacity. That's a lean manufacturing process, right? We try to find a way to reduce waste and increase capacity. And then, but it's all tapped out. These guys are working 7 days a week, 24/7, 3 shifts, sometimes 4 shorter shifts. And most of these things are automated, 90 to 95% automated. You can't automate anymore or go any faster. So they're tapped out. And so you can't just increase production unless you buy new equipment and new factories. But the new equipment also requires more chips, which is dependent on the chip themselves. So you have this vicious cycle of back and forth where we can't even create new factories.
Wow.
So I don't know if I'm gone deviated from the original question here, but I think people don't realize how complex the issue is, and that's why we can't solve it overnight.
I know that in the United States, there's been a number of manufacturers, chip manufacturers, who have said they're getting ready to invest billions upon billions of dollars to create new factories to be able to produce more chips. I know just the other day, Intel mentioned a $20 billion investment in a new facility. But just because you say you're going to make that investment and build that factory, it's not something that can happen overnight, at least not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so the problem is that the equipment that's required to produce chips are very complex, very advanced robotics and electronics. And then they need a special clean room, right? The clean room is, I think, is something like 1,000 times cleaner than your clean rooms in the hospitals, for example. So it's not just the investment. I think it's $10 or $15 billion to build a new chip manufacturer, but it's the time. It takes time to procure these equipment, to set it up. And so it's a good 2 to 3 years. Like, you can actually build a car factory in 2 to 3 years and get it up and running, but you can't get a chip manufacturing up and running in that short time. So I know Samsung is also setting up a new shop in Texas, or they announced that.
Yeah.
And then also in China and Taiwan and elsewhere, they're all governments all funding new projects, right? So that's why I keep saying, if people are just patient, let's say maybe not 6 months, but in a year, there'll be a dramatic difference. Once these factories are up and running, we might have the opposite issue of oversupply. Yeah, it just takes a long time to set these factories up, because they're very different from a normal production like a cars, because they're so automated.
I have a question. When it comes to automotive, we've read a lot of stories that talk about how the semiconductors, the chips within vehicles, are less complex potentially, or more legacy than what you might find in like your consumer electronics, or different products that are that we all touch every day. Is there validity to that, David? Is that also part of why we've seen one of the storylines early on during the chip crisis was these manufacturers, the people that had the fabs, they didn't want to bring back automotive. You took down your forecast. Well, that's less profitable for us. We don't want to do that. Is there any validity to that storyline? Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. So there's about anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 chips in a car, as much as 3,000 on the newer models.
Wow.
And majority of that, like, I don't know, I'm taking a guess now, but maybe 80% of it is the legacy chips. These are the older chips that are a little bit bigger, not as efficient. So the newer chips, they're able to put more transistors onto the chip. So millions of transistors get placed onto the actual microchip, right? Or the semiconductor chip. But the older one has less chips in there. They're more robust, maybe a little bit more durable because they're not as sensitive. And then, it takes car companies 4 to 6 years to retool a new model. So they obviously, even with the current model that's equipped with newer advanced features, is still dependent on older chips because that's how they designed it. And so you can't just, like, let's say a power seat mechanism or power mirror mechanism or a chip to control your stereo system. This has been built from many years ago. You can't simply convert them into newer chips. So you have to wait for next model year. And that's why the car companies are so dependent on the older chips. But on the supply chain side, these chip manufacturers have no incentive to build these older chips. They're less profitable. They're harder to produce. The new chips are much more profitable, and that's the future, right? Like all the newer technologies from computer games and laptops and iPhone are using newer chips at a more profitable number. So why would they go and build a whole new factory, spend billions to build the old one? No one's going to do that. So it's a really unfortunate situation for car companies where they need more and more chips, but the chip manufacturer have no incentive to produce them. And then on top of that, you add this years and years of complicated relationship the car companies had with their suppliers, and where suppliers are now often treated with the best respect in terms of negotiating for logistics and cost. So they've been beaten up over the years, and for the first time, they're finding some, newfound negotiation power. So they're not going to give up this easily and just convert everything to what the car companies want, because they're not sure what's going to happen a year down the road. Whereas the electronics industry keeps buying more and more, and that industry, it just keeps growing. And so for them, it's a better customer base. So it's a difficult one for car companies to be able to work with this. And then so that's why they started buying directly from the chip manufacturer. They never did that before, and now they're negotiating directly, which is the right thing to do. But it's going to take years for the automakers to convert their chips to the newer version.
I have a question for you, and it wasn't one that I thought of until we started this conversation, so I apologize.
That's okay.
Had there not been the pandemic that we're involved in, and the older car companies had not canceled chips that they had on order, would we have still eventually run into a chip shortage problem? And did the pandemic just exacerbate it and bring it on faster?
A good question. Could we down the road still have a chip shortage? That's possible if there's a dramatic demand for other electronics outside the auto industry. But the difference is that they're predictable, you see, like the gradual increase in demand, I should say, for personal electronics can be forecasted and can be very accurately predicted. So even if it goes up by 10, 20, 30%, you can see the growth, so you can actually gear up for that. But so I believe that if there wasn't a pandemic and there was no water shortage or drought in Taiwan, and there was no fire that killed some factories in Asia, I don't think we would have had any of this chip shortage problem at all. But again, it's not just a pandemic. There was other natural disasters and so forth that also took away some of the capacity. And so that's also a problem. And even if the demand continued to increase for the next couple of years, it would have been quite manageable.
Wow.
Now, David, I have a question. It's another buzzword that I know we're guilty of throwing around with maybe not the a full and complete understanding or most certainly not the expertise that you have to shed light on this. Just-in-time manufacturing and practices that relate to just-in-time. Can you talk a little bit about what just-in-time is and how that may have exacerbated what we're experiencing right now? And I'll add a little cherry on top. I read the report that came out from the White House today that talked about the amount of inventory, the supply of inventory for semiconductors that the actual manufacturers have. Kind of speaks to like they also operate in a just-in-time fashion as well, at least I think. So everyone operates in just-in-time. What is it, and how did that exacerbate things?
Sure. Like, the interesting thing is, of all the different lean manufacturing things I teach, the just-in-time is the most requested. Yeah, because, basically, if you carry inventory, the more inventory you carry, the more money it costs you, because you have to buy more, and it costs money to store. And the cost of storing goods in a warehouse, shockingly, is 10 to 15% of the value of the goods. So, like, you just don't want to carry it unless you really have to. So over the years, Toyota Production System, or Toyota, became a household name for only buying what you need when you need them at the perfect, precise moment, right? So, for example, if you go to Toyota factory in Japan, they only have 2 hours of inventory at any given moment, and they're
Did you say
producing
2 hours?
2 hours. Yeah, two
Oh
hours.
my God.
Yeah, it's only setting. So whatever that comes into the factory stays in there for exactly 2 hours before, or less than 2 hours before it's installed into a car. For everything, there's about 50,000 parts in there, and the truck that brings these parts in has to bring exactly within plus or minus 1 minute. So if it's a 12:15 p.m. delivery, you cannot arrive at 12:13 or 12:18. For every minute, either you're too early or too late, you're penalized. And so you can see in Nagoya highway, there's all these trucks waiting so that they can arrive just in time.
Oh my
So
gosh.
yeah, so just in time is truly just
Wow.
in time in most car companies, even those are not those outside Toyota, for example. But Toyota learned a lesson. It happened 2 times. One is a huge fire that happened at one of the suppliers years ago, and then it was for a brake pad supplier. And shockingly, that supplier supplied for something like 18 factories in Japan, and everything was shut down within 2 hours, right? Because of 2 hour buffer. And so
Yeah.
they learned one lesson from that. And then, of course, we had the earthquake and other natural disasters that also took out capacity for hours. So surprisingly, against its own policy and philosophy, Toyota decided to actually create more buffer by doing 2 things. One is diversification. So you diversify your supplier base so that if one goes down, you have another source you buy from. So you buy from 2 places instead of one. And then secondly, that you building excess additional capacity at the supplier base. So if something happens, then they have like, for example, backup equipment that can quickly ramp up to produce. So they did that for all of the what they call critical components that are specialized product that can't be easily given to another supplier. And so that's why when the chip situation happened, they had, first of all, a better forecast because they were expecting to continue selling cars versus other manufacturers who just want to cut cost right away.
Mhm.
And secondly, they had this diversification of supply chain and backup system already from prior lessons. And that's why they were able to sort it out for a long time, right? Right up until last fall when they also got hit finally. But they survived better than the most because of the fact that they actually went backwards with supply chain and carry a little bit more than they need, but not necessarily at their factory. It's being cascaded down to the suppliers who has to kind of carry that burden. But Toyota also owns many of its suppliers, right? Unlike other car companies like Denso, which provides all these electronic components to Toyota, it's owned by or partly owned by Toyota. So their supply chain system is very robust, better forecasting, more inventory, and not just in time to a degree, but not for key critical components that they know might become short. So I think, but the problem is in the Western companies here in North America or even Europe, the more you can cut in terms of inventory, the more money you save, and so they're going to cut it right down to the bone. And when the pandemic started, they assumed that the car sales will go straight downhill and they cut as much as they can from the forecasting, and then that's why they couldn't catch up, basically.
The 10 to 15% that you mentioned of the goods value as the cost is really telling, because Pops, you've talked about floor plan costs for dealerships for a long time.
Mhm.
And that's, we're moving in a model where Europe has always been order your vehicle. It's not sitting there on the lot. The cost infrastructure for dealerships in the United States has always been a bit higher, simply because they have so much inventory on hand, and we're starting to see higher profits than ever before. And partly that's because floor plan costs are down. I've got one other question for David. We got to be super respectful with his time. As you can probably tell by now watching this video, he's a highly sought after individual. But Pops, I want final question from you, and I've got one on my end as well.
Well, I was just one of my questions was going to be: is there a way to mitigate some of these supply chain issues?
Mhm.
And realistically, you had just spoken about that by forcing the suppliers to be the ones that are actually carrying extra inventory, and it's their cost to carry the inventory as opposed to the manufacturers. So I find that very, very telling that the ultimate manufacturer that's getting the goods, they don't want to have any inventory on hand, but they force their suppliers to actually have that inventory.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's multiple ways to mitigate this for the future. The first and the most important thing they have to do is to redesign their equipment, redesign their components so that it's not dependent on the legacy older chips, right? That's the first thing. So that will take time, maybe as much as 3 to 5 years to change out their components. That's a very important thing because there are more supply of the newer chips. That's the first thing they have to do. Unfortunately, they're also adding more and more equipment, right? Artificial intelligence and everything from head-up display to autonomous technologies. So, the problem is that even though they're going to be redesigning, they're also needing more chips as well. So that's going to be interesting. And the second thing is what I mentioned earlier, which is you have to diversify. And we always say in supply chain, you have to diversify by geographic location, by the type of supplier, so basically by country, right? So you want to diversify not just within North America or just within one country, but international. So you end up with supplier in China, Taiwan, and the US, for example. And then the second thing is that they have to forecast accurately. So there's a technique called demand forecast. And we teach that in the kind of advanced supply chain, but it requires a kind of complicated equation to estimate what the demand will be in the future. So obviously, none of us have crystal ball and we can't predict 100%. But the more factors you're taking into account, everything from weather to politics and so forth, are all thrown into this equation. And if you can estimate and forecast more accurately, then you can give longer forecasting to the supplier. So instead of giving typically 2 to 3 months in advance, if you can give them 6 months or year in advance, they can ramp up and build it for you. But no one's going to give 1 year surplus forecast, because if you're wrong, you're going to end up with all this excessive inventory. But that's what they're going to have to do. They have to revamp their calculation for demand forecasting, and then they're going to have to take a bit of a risk and order ahead. Ordering in advance for longer term, for up to a year, maybe even, and that way they will have a lot less issue down the road. And then the third thing is, because car companies are so cost conscious, you can actually buy more chips in many cases if you want to, but a higher rate.
Mhm.
So it's not just a chip shortage; it's that there's a shortage of cheaper chips. Basically, if you're willing to pay, you can get a lot of the chips that they claim they can't get. So unfortunately, they're going to have to just let some of those calculation work itself out and just buy the more expensive chip and then reduce the cost somewhere else. But instead, some of the brand manufacturers from Europe are shipping cars without features, right? They've taken off the stereo system, or the touch panel is missing, or GM took out the heated seats and so forth. Well, they didn't have to do that. They could just pay more for the chip and put them back in. So they're going to have to struggle with not just supply chain, but whole economics of how this evolves from now on. They might have to pass on the cost up to the consumer, but I think most consumers would rather pay $100 more, $200 more, and get all the features than to lose them. But they don't give that choice to the consumer. They simply chosen to take that away because they feel that well, mainly because they need to make more money, really, in the context of increasing supply chain costs. So those are things they can do. But I think eventually, though, I really think in 6 months, but let's say by the fall, it's going to get substantially better. And then by end of the year, we won't solve this problem, but I think you just won't hear so much of it. And certainly by early 2023, when some of these other factories are up and running, I think we'll all be surprised at how normal it could be in a year. A lot of companies are saying, hey, it could still take 2 to 3 years. I think they want us to believe the supply chain is going to be short for a very long time for negotiation purposes and for many other reasons. I don't think it's going to be more than about a year or so to go back to kind of a semi-normal situation.
Wow.
You know what I really like about David, Pops?
He's smarter than us.
Okay, yes, of course. I like his background too. He
Yes.
answered your question
Yes.
before he asked it, and then he went even deeper, which we appreciate.
Yes.
And then in that answer, he answered my question, which was going to be about: are we going to see increases in costs? And that was actually the reason I was thinking about it, David, is because we reference frequently. There was a Boston Consulting Group a publication that talked about the chip shortage, the car shortage, and they had this very fascinating page that showed the amount of expense, supply expense, that went towards semiconductors for a regular ICE vehicle, an ICE vehicle with advanced driving systems, and an EV vehicle with advanced driving systems. And you just saw this chart go up and to the right. And to your comment earlier about 1,500 to 2,000 chips, but some have up to 3,000. It's getting more expensive to produce these next generations of vehicles that we're seeing. And yeah, we're all adults here. Car companies are going to want to keep their profit margins where they are. That's going to get passed along to the dealer, and the dealer is going to pass it along to the consumer. We're going to see MSRPs going up. At least that's my expectation. And it's interesting because you've got to think that the companies that come out on the other side of this experience, it's almost like the Great Recession. They'll be better for it in the sense that they'll be able to sustain their profits better. They'll be leaner. They'll be meaner. I think that's the next generation of what we're looking at on the automaker side. Very naive perspective, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, those are really good point there, Zach. And you mentioned Boston Consulting, so I have lots of friends at Boston Consulting, so I might get in trouble if I say this, but I know they're predicting many more years, right, with chip shortages. But Boston Consulting, who have some of the smartest people there, of course, is in the business of providing supply chain consulting and helping a variety of different companies to manage supply chain better. So to be honest, the more problems there are in supply chain, the more work for consultants in general, right? And so it's probably in their best interest if the supply chain issues carry longer. Again, I'll get in trouble for saying this, but that's okay. I have lots of friends in the management consulting firm, and they know me well. So yeah, so I think that's why they might be predicting still many more years to come. But I really think in about a year, no more than a year and a half, it'll be a dramatically different world. We probably wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Well, I know, David, I hope that the supply chain issues do go away. And if and when your predictions do come true, and it's sooner rather than later, we'd still like to have you back on the show. We know our audience has learned an incredible amount from this video.
Yes.
Again, check out David's channel, Automotive Press. If you're in the industry and you need his consulting services, go to his website. Like, he's obviously the man when it comes to this stuff. Good luck getting him, though. We feel very, very fortunate. But David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on, and you're welcome back anytime. So thank you.
Oh, no, thank you, Ray and Zach. It's really honored to be here. I'm really thankful for the chance to talk about this. So, yeah, more than happy. Anytime I'll be back with you guys.
Thank you so much, David. I got to tell you that I feel so much smarter now than when we started this conversation. I have a much better understanding as to how it all works. And I can't thank you enough for sharing what you have with us today.
Oh, no, you're very welcome anytime. Yeah, please come and take some of my courses. You can take any of them for free.
Oh, we just might take you up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Okay, thank you again.